Thank you very much, Sorspas. Someone mentioned the Kurdish saying that we have no friends but the mountains. And if you go to other nations and countries torn by genocide and war, you can hear some kind of similar quotings. If you go to Israel, they can quote Abba Eban in the 50s saying that half of the world wants to destroy Israel and the other half don't care if that would happen. If you go to Bosnia, there is a saying that there is a light in the tunnel, but as a matter of fact, it's only the lights from the train going straight to you. So I think that what is important is that we can look forward and don't slide backwards. And we need to know our history, but not stay in the past. 2 years ago, in the Swedish parliament, on the initiative of several Kurdish members of parliament, we have 6, as said, and soon we have also 7, because one will come in February as well. The Sweden Kurdistan Network was founded, and the network aims to deepen the relationship between Sweden and Kurdistan and to send a clear signal that there is, in fact, a political, official support in Sweden also for self-determination in Kurdistan. And the network holds meetings on a regular basis and invites guests to talk about the situation in all 4 parts of Kurdistan. And we also arrange a remembrance ceremony now in March each year for the victims of Halabja and the Untold campaign. Now, in December last year, the Swedish parliament recognized Al-Anfal as genocide. And I am aware that there has been some discussions regarding the implications of this decision. Therefore, I would like to state it out very clearly that the Swedish parliament indeed have recognized Al-Anfal as genocide. The parliament recognized it in a report from the Foreign Affairs Committee, and all 8 parties in the committee stood behind it, and the report was also approved uniformly in the chamber in accordance with normal practice. So that should be very clear. Here is the passage on the Anfal campaign in the document in its entirety. I quote, "With regard to the proposals to recognize the biochemical attacks in Halabja in March 1988, which was part of the military Anfal campaign as genocide, the committee considers that in principle it's not for the parliament as a representative body to make such international legal standpoints. The committee's basic opinion is that it is through research, open debate, and where appropriate, legal challenges, it is determined how historical events and processes are to be defined. In this context, it should be noted that there not only is a trial in Iraq that have ruled the term genocide as defined for the Anfal campaign. The human rights organization Human Rights Watch issued several reports of the Anfal campaign, which resulted in a comprehensive report in 1993 titled Genocide in Iraq, the Anfal campaign against the Kurds. After the fall of Saddam Hussein, more details were found in Iraqi archives on the planning and implementation of the Anfal campaign, and in 2007, convictions for genocide and crimes against humanity was announced for those responsible. Based on research and statements from organizations as well as the judgment in Iraq, it is possible to establish that the Anfal campaign was genocide. End of quote. That was the entirety of the text. Now, the key aspect here for us in the Swedish parliament is that this decision was made in agreement. All 8 parties in the parliament agreed on the text. It's not an easy task to reach a compromise that everyone is satisfied with. It takes long negotiations and careful considerations. There are different wills. Therefore, it was of great importance that we managed to reach a consensus in the Foreign Affairs Committee as well as in the chamber in the parliament. The recognition of the Anfal campaign as genocide is an important statement in principle, but is also an important moral statement as well as a message to the Iraqi government that more can and should be done for the survivors and the victims' relatives. If we had not managed to reach a consensus in an early stage. The question of recognition had become partisan politics. The victims of Halabja and their relatives and all the Untold victims would have served as bats in the Swedish political debate. This was something we wanted to avoid at all costs. Let me give you 2 examples why. First, 3 years ago, the Swedish parliament voted on recognizing the genocide on Armenians and other Christian groups in the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. I supported that decision, of course. The recognition passed, though, with only 1 vote. The parliament's decision then imposed the Swedish government to also act for recognition. And so far, this has not happened. The signals we have received from our Prime Minister and Foreign Minister is that there is no intention from the government in Sweden to do so. Thus, the parliament has recognized the Armenian genocide, but the government refuses to do the same. Then we have another example regarding the parliament's decision quite recently in the autumn when the parliament decided to recognize the sovereign state of Western Sahara. Or not a sovereign state, but recognize Western Sahara as a sovereign state, independent state. Neither in this case there are any intentions from our government to follow that obligation and also go for a recognition. As I mentioned, we wanted to avoid a situation where this scenario could occur in the issue of the Untold campaign. Thus, we emphasize the importance of unity among the parties in order to minimize any doubts about the parliament's position. Well, we have raised some doubts, though, but that was not our intention. We do not wish to contribute to new conflicts or political quarrels. Rather, we want to contribute to ease the burden that so many families carried on their shoulders. Therefore, the decision in the Swedish parliament was important, and I hope our decision will be followed by other parliaments around the world as well. Spas.
Moving swiftly on, our next speaker is Gillian Walnes, who's from the Anne Frank Trust, which is a partner organisation of the superb Anne Frank House in Amsterdam, which if you haven't visited, I would do so as soon as possible.
Thank you very much. It's really a great honour to be here today. And I think I'm going to present quite a different perspective to you, because I've been asked to speak from our own experience of how you garner sympathy for a cause that may seem distant and remote from people's lives here, and how to make genocide something meaningful to those who are living very different lives in different times and in a different place. And I'm going to just give you a case study of using our own experience. We have found that the answer to the question about garnering sympathy lies in creating empathy. And empathy is created through personalization and identifying with a single person. By an individual learning a story of another person, and we heard it just now in Gabrielle's wonderful address, they think about, gosh, this could have been me. This could have been my family. And Anne Frank, for example, is still cited as the most famous victim of the Holocaust, the child that gives the suffering a human face. And our educational charity, the Anne Frank Trust UK, uses her story to create understanding of the importance of each and every individual human life. And we work in very different audiences. We take the story of a Jewish girl, a Jewish experience, sometimes to schools and environments that are totally Muslim, but young people know that they can identify with that little girl's experience because their lives, their thoughts, their ambitions, their hopes, their fears are just like their own. It's actually by accident that Anne Frank came to be known above others. Otto Frank, Anne Frank's father, arrived back in Amsterdam many months after his liberation from Auschwitz. When he learnt that his 2 teenage daughters had perished, he was given Anne's diary by Miep Gies, one of the courageous Christian helpers of the family in hiding. At great risk, Miep had rescued Anne's diary after the family's arrest, hoping to return this private diary to its owner. Mr. Frank knew that his daughter's greatest wish was to become a published writer, And so he decided, after consulting those whose opinions he respected, to try and get her diary published. Well, knowing what we know now, that over 30 million copies have been sold, that it's been translated into 70 different languages, it's quite amazing to hear that Otto Frank found this task enormously difficult at that time. No one wanted to publish a wartime diary, as the Dutch people wanted to move on with their lives and look forward, not back. Even the BBC radio report from Bergen-Belsen by the renowned British news reporter Richard Dimbleby, which brought the extent of the mass killing of the Holocaust to the world, never even mentioned that the majority of the corpses he saw were of Jews. And throughout the next decades, it remained pretty much the same. Holocaust survivors only really started to speak about their experiences as they became older. In the years following the war, they had set about the task of rebuilding their lives, studying, finding work or starting businesses, marrying, raising families. They kept their heads down as part of their survival mechanism. Many wanted to protect their own children from learning the horror, and anyway, no one was listening. The Western world had a new enemy, the Iron Curtain that had fallen across Europe. Although the Holocaust had been declared a genocide in 1948 and the United Nations had been formed in its shadow, the war crimes trials that had taken place at Nuremberg and several eyewitness testimony books had already been published, there were, in fact, several key events over the following decades that brought about public knowledge and sympathy. Anne Frank's diary itself actually only alludes to the terrors outside the safety of the hiding place, and the subsequent American play and movie placed emphasis on hope, which was actually deemed suitable at the time for public consumption. Then things started to change. The capture and trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961 reminded the world of the crimes perpetrated 20 years before. The American TV miniseries Holocaust in the 1970s so shocked its West German viewers that it helped to block legislation in the West German parliament that would have allowed the statute of limitations on war crimes to expire. Steven Spielberg's film of Schindler's List in 1994 and its multiple Academy Awards brought the story to another generation. And our own travelling exhibitions on Anne Frank have been seen by over 3 million people in Britain. The David Irving libel trial in 2000 demonstrated to the public that Holocaust denial was still alive in the UK. These events and interpretations have helped to bring the Holocaust further into popular awareness. The Kurdish Genocide is described by this gathering as the untold story, and the Holocaust is now considered the told story. But as you can see, it took a long time. Academics throughout the world are still studying the Holocaust in its details and continuing to learn. In 10 days' time, Britain will mark Holocaust Memorial Day. This national event came through the Stockholm International Conference on the Holocaust in 2000, and the first British ceremonies took place in January 2001. That was some 55 years after the end of the war. There was even some resistance among members of the Jewish community in the UK. They felt that drawing attention to their suffering may backfire and cause resentment. But in effect, the day is used to remember the uniqueness of the Holocaust, but also to draw attention to more recent genocides in the world, reminding us that human capacity for brutality does not diminish. While recognizing that with any mass murder, there are the common features of a hatred so profound that it enables indifference towards brutality and suffering, and how suspicion of the other and separateness can build up over many generations, the unique features of any genocide must also be recognized. If not, we can become misled into believing that any set of circumstances can occur anywhere at any time, and we'll lose the will to do our utmost to ensure that they don't. We recognize that the Holocaust came about through a particular set of circumstances. I won't go into them because we're short of time. We will mark Holocaust Memorial Day on the 27th of January with civic ceremonies, tree plantings and candle lightings, but also by telling the stories of individuals. There are now less than 300 Holocaust survivors still alive in the UK, but many tell their personal stories in schools and on public platforms. It leaves a profound impact on those who have the privilege of hearing these stories firsthand. The Anne Frank Trust has actually been taking elderly Holocaust survivors into prisons for 11 years, and hearing a genteel elderly man or woman stand up and tell of unbelievable suffering that their own families experience can give criminals in British prisons a new sense of perspective of their own grievances against society. Now, the Anne Frank Trust has also been able to publicly tell the story of one Kurdish refugee family, creating awareness and empathy for that story. In 2007, we gave an Anne Frank Award for moral courage to a teenage girl called Banar Talabani, who was living just outside Birmingham. This received national and local publicity. In 2008, she came to light a memorial candle at our annual fundraising lunch, which is attended by over 500 people. And if you'll allow me just 1 minute and a few seconds, I just want to very briefly tell you Banar's story, because young people really started to relate to this girl. She was born, as you probably realize, into a family in northern Iraq. Several of her family members, including her father and grandfather, were prominent members of the rebellion against Saddam Hussein. And in 1991, to escape the bombing of the Kurdish villages, Banar's mother decided to run away with her children. The family walked for days, trying desperately to avoid the continual bombing around them. And because of the lack of food and clean water, Banar's baby brother became very ill and died within 2 days of the family crossing over into Iran. I won't go on because it's a story that you know, many of you know, and many of you sadly have experienced. But she came to England, and she was determined not to waste the opportunities she could only dream about in Iraq. In just 13 months, Banar had mastered English to such a level that she passed her 11+ exam. And she's never forgotten the images of suffering she witnessed as a small child. She joined and led the Amnesty International group, and she was elected head girl of her school. In 2007, we presented her with her award. She now leads a normal life which young people can relate to. She's studying medicine at Cardiff University. She is an exemplary role model for British young people. And she's real. I follow her on Facebook, and I can see she loves parties, music. She studies hard. She's got hopes and ambitions, and she's a very beautiful young woman. She's very proud of her. And when I told her I was speaking here today, Banar emailed me with a message for you all. She said, "It's so comforting for me to see that the stories of so many people who are killed will not be forgotten. It's also very sad that people are still suffering today, for example, in Syria. Sadly, genocide is not a thing of the past." So the key to the empathy and feeling for suffering is to personalize, to tell stories, tell your stories, and people understand, they feel, this could be me. As Primo Levi so eloquently wrote, "One single Anne Frank moves us more than the countless others who suffered just as she did, but whose faces have remained in the shadows." Perhaps it's better that way. If we were capable of taking in the suffering of all these people, we'd not be able to live. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. Akhtar Chaudhry has to go. We wish him a good trip back to Oslo. Our next speaker is no relation, Dr. Gregory Kent, or Brother Kent as I know, and he's got 5 minutes, and it starts any time now. Sit down if you like.
It's shrinking by the second.
Yes, it's shrinking.
Thank you, Dad.
I'll get you for that.
The title of my presentation was originally Recognition and Non-Recognition, and I think of what I mean by non-recognition as an implicit or explicit denial of genocide. I'm actually thinking of changing it to my incredible shrinking and expanding presentation, because I thought I only had 8 minutes, which is a real challenge to an academic like myself. I'm going to talk at least 3 hours. And then I got here and I saw people talking for 20 minutes. I thought, great. And now I'm back down to 6 minutes, and now I'm down to 5 minutes. So I better get going.
Stop wasting time.
Exactly. So I'm going to draw on my expertise on Bosnia and other genocides and really talk, sort of hit this head on really with the sort of why, when, who and how of recognition. You know, what is recognition? We could spend a lot of time talking about that, particularly being an academic, but it's to do with understanding, it's to do with believing, it's to do with accepting a phenomenon. But I sort of see it as a conceptual battle between different actors in national, international, and global societies. Why is recognition important in this context of genocide? Well, clearly one of the most obvious things to say about it is that genocide is the crime of crimes. I know, sorry, notwithstanding what was said earlier on about ecocide, which would obviously entail another separate debate. But why recognition is important is because we need to do various things once we've recognized genocide, and they involve, in the first place, if possible, preventing genocide. If that is not possible, then limiting genocide, and then there are questions that come out of... these mics are strange, it seems to have gone off now. Is there any reason for that? I'll talk louder. Justice is obviously a question that comes out of recognition and can't come before recognition. And finally, as some of the speakers in the last panel talked about, restitution is obviously a really important issue for victims in particular. When genocide is recognized, I think is quite an important concept to think about. And I've sort of just on the back of an envelope here sort of developed a kind of spectrum of when genocides are recognized. There's a kind of ideal of immediate recognition. Very few cases would ever meet that. I wondered whether the Kosovo situation, which didn't turn into a genocide, but had various elements that were genocidal and various plans that were put forward, such as Operation Horseshoe by the Serbian regime of the time, but that was stopped. So maybe that was our one big success story. Rwanda was recognized fairly quickly, although not quick enough to enact any intervention. Darfur, similarly, was recognized after a year or two quite explicitly by the US Secretary of State and subsequently by the President. The Holocaust, of course, had quite a delayed recognition during the actual war, and then years and years later, decades even, it really came to be understood in the way that we know it today. But of course, the focus of my presentation today, the Anfal and Bosnia, were both very much delayed recognitions, partial and contested. And then there are a few genocides, I would suggest, that have not even been recognized and perhaps never will be due to lack of evidential support. And I suppose what's interesting about this is that there can be movement on this spectrum as well. So, for example, I would say that the EU's kind of recognition of its failure over Bosnia to take action to protect the Bosnian victims of the Serbian aggression was kind of quite strongly recognized. But if you actually look at their policies now in relation to enlargement and expansion and integration of the Balkans, seems to have gone off their kind of radar in a sense that Bosnia was ever a victim in this case, with their sort of promotion of Serbia, for example, much ahead of Bosnia. Bosnia is completely hamstrung with its political system today, and there's very little recognition that Bosnia was the victim, actually needs extra help in this case. So I think there's fluctuations, movement on that spectrum. All of these genocides, I would say every genocide is contested, so recognition is no simple matter ever, or challenged, sometimes by anti-Semites in the case of the Holocaust. Academics regularly like to take on board and question, that's our job, to be critical and to question whether certain situations, certain contexts should actually be recognized as genocides. Rwanda is currently one example where there was various truths are being sort of questioned. And then there are sort of groups who oppose the victim group in a genocide, maybe Serbian groups, for example, over Bosnia, who will regularly try to deny that anything happened. There's many groups in Serbia deny Srebrenica, for example. And then there's also some hardcore people on the left, in particular, and some on the right who regularly try to oppose recognition of genocides because of the implications that might involve some kind of intervention by the hated West. So there are a range of actors who can recognize. The most important, I would say, are the states and international organizations. And I mentioned the EU already as not actually recognizing genocide, but recognizing this massive failure. And the UN as well, in Kofi Annan's Srebrenica report of, I think, 1999, they really explicitly state how appalling the policies of the UN and the member states were in relation to the Srebrenica debacle. So the Holocaust, I would say, has been explicitly recognized by many states, but generally, I suppose Armenia as well, which is highly contentious. But beyond that, very few genocides are usually recognized, notwithstanding what our Scandinavian colleagues have said today about the Anfal. Judicial organs are very important actors in this. The domestic and international tribunals have been very important in the cases of Bosnia and Kurdistan in particular, in giving some recognition, albeit quite limited, I would suggest. In the case of Bosnia, for example, Srebrenica has been the absolute focus of the jurisprudence, and there's been, if not implicit, denial of the systematic massacres of Bosnians that took place in the early months of 1992, for example, and other atrocities later. You could argue that the sieges of Sarajevo and other cities were part of a genocidal campaign. All of that has been brushed aside with this absolute focus on the, quite rightly in some senses, focus of the killing of 8,000 Muslim men and boys in Srebrenica in July 1995. I've only got 1 minute left now. I'm going to quickly try to move up. Civil society bodies are also important, the media and academia, and wider society at large. So how does recognition occur or not occur? The key issue really is a conceptual one. I was going to talk a little bit about the media and their role in terms of getting access to the zone of genocide, and also the means of dissemination. And there's a lot to say about that. I've written a lot about that in my book, Framing War and Genocide. I'll pass on that today. Just to concentrate briefly on what is genocide. Well, we know that it is the intention to destroy in whole or part a national, ethnic, religious or racial grouping. And that's the legal definition. And a lot of jurisprudence, as our previous speakers have said much more ably than myself, has focused on issues of intent, what constitutes part, what would be a group, and what kind of evidence would amount to destruction of part of a group. And I would argue that after 6 years, we had our first genocide case in Bosnia. In Kurdistan, it took almost 20 years. But quite a limited understanding of genocide, quite a narrow definition, I would argue, came out of that jurisprudence. In the case of Bosnia, I think it's probably similar in the Kurdistan case, but I don't have enough evidence to say. That on the other side of the debate have been academics who've taken a much broader perspective, talking about the exclusion of political groups, the destruction of social groups as being genocide, the attacks on civilians. Just a blatant mass attack on a civilian is genocidal, according to my colleague Professor Martin Shaw. The destruction of their social power would be classed as genocide as well. So for once, I would say that academics are possibly more in touch with ordinary people, which is a very rare thing to be able to say, and more in touch with the victims of genocide. And I will stop there.
Thank you very much indeed. So, final two speakers, 5 minutes each. That will allow some time before a very short tea break. And they are David Russell, if you would take the stand or sit down, whichever you prefer.
So I'm speaking specifically about the situation in Rwanda. I won't dwell too much on the recognition of genocide at the time in Rwanda. That's been largely and well documented by many academics. I definitely recommend the book of Linda Melvin, A People Betrayed, that tells the story of the systematic failings at the UN that resulted in the lack of intervention that potentially and probably would have prevented the genocide, or certainly the scale of the genocide. Survivors Fund has been working in Rwanda since 1994 in the immediate aftermath of the genocide, and I think the work of the organisation is specifically focused, which we heard in the previous session, on about rebuilding the lives of the survivors of the genocide, but bringing justice as well, which is a critical component of the trajectory of recognition that is focused specifically not only on, for survivors, the recognition of the genocide itself, but also what that recognition brings. And in respect to justice and the challenge for survivors in Rwanda today, that focus is very much on restitution, on the issue of reparation. As we approach the 20th anniversary of the genocide next year in 2014, there is a call from survivors that the apologies and the acknowledgement of responsibility that over the last 19 years has been well heard and also well documented, that should translate into meaningful reparation for survivors today. In the immediate aftermath of the genocide, there was an acknowledgement of the failings at the UN. There was a recognition of the genocide almost immediately within the UN with the establishment of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda at the end of 1994. There was a recognition of UN member states that not only did genocide happen in Rwanda, but subsequently there was a responsibility of the UN in order to act to try to deliver retributive justice. The parallel between the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia and the ICC subsequently is that the ICTR, uniquely amongst those three bodies, has no mechanism or mandate for restorative justice. So whereas the ICC, through the establishment of its establishment from the Rome Statute, has a mandate to deliver compensation for victims of cases heard at the ICC. Likewise, the ICTR currently is undergoing a process. It launched a commission and a study to investigate how compensation can be awarded to victims of cases heard there. The ICTR has never had that mandate. And in respect to recognition of the genocide from the perspective of the survivors, this is a massive omission. It is a shortcoming recognised by consecutive presidents of the ICTR. They don't have that mandate, and so subsequently it's not within their power to make awards of reparation. But the work of SURF is focused on how then we try to address that. And around the anniversary of the genocide is a unique opportunity to try do so. The United States, the UN, the Belgian government, the French government, those probably were the four most significant actors during the genocide itself. The UN acknowledged responsibility, apologized for the genocide. President Clinton very famously did on the 10th anniversary of the genocide in 2004. The Belgian government also has done. The French have yet to do so. But what those apologies and that admission of responsibility translates into, I think, is ultimately what is critical for survivors, and I think what we have been hearing a lot about over the course of the conference today. So essentially, to wrap up, my focus would be to concentrate on what the meaning of recognition means from the perspective of the survivors, of the victims of genocide. That recognition needs to, and is importantly, has to translate into more than just acknowledgement. For that recognition to be meaningful, it needs to be restorative, and that restorative, restorative justice in particular, translates into reparation, whether that means compensation, whether that means assistance, whether that means a guarantee of non-repetition. I think that is a critical focus. It is the work and the focus of SURF over the course of the year ahead. I think in the break, at around 6 o'clock, there will be a short film about the work of SURF. A lot of that has been about rebuilding the lives of survivors through shelter, through healthcare, through education. But actually, there is a need to focus beyond those development goals, to focus into justice. And what that justice means is ultimately about a recognition that is remunerative, that is financial, that ultimately will provide for the future, not only of survivors of genocide, but also critically important, as we know, within the Jewish community for the children of survivors. The repercussions and the consequences of genocide extend beyond just the survivors themselves. It also is felt and endured by the children of survivors as well. And I think that's something we need to be aware of in our work, and I think is as important in respect to the Kurdish community as it has been and continues to be in the Rwandan community.
Thank you very much. Last but not least, and our most disciplined speaker, is Brian Brivati, who has 5 minutes. Otherwise, it starts to eat into your questions and your tea time. So don't feel guilty and don't feel under any pressure. Just get on with it.
Thanks very much, Gary. I will try and stick to that. We heard this morning that the purpose of international recognition was protection against recurrence, the rights of victims, reconciliation, and compensation for victims. We've also heard in many of the discussions today that it's about fighting indifference. So I suppose either we could think that 26,000 signatures on our petition is an excellent result, or that it's an indictment of the indifference of people to these kinds of events. So I want to explore what the process means in terms of trying to find what we call recognition and why it is important, because there is a lot of competition for that compassion and for that recognition. And I'll return to that briefly at the end. We heard in a couple of the presentations that justice is a key part of recognition. And I think we have to ask what we mean by justice. Do we mean achieving a judgment against those who were perpetrators of these crimes? Do we mean that we want punishment of those perpetrators? And there are different models. In Rwanda, one of the models was about achieving local justice, which allowed people to continue to live together in communities. Do we want process of restorative justice and ultimately compensation? Or do we want something much deeper than that, which came up once today, which was the word closure? And what do we mean by closure of an event like this? And does closure in the end mean healing? And healing has come up in a couple of our discussions today. What would a post-genocidal state look like where we had achieved healing or closure? Would it look like Israel? Would it look like today's Rwanda? So in other words, does genocide ever end? And if we're looking for international recognition, will that moment come at which this event of genocide somehow comes to a close? Does genocide end when the killing stops? Well, we've heard that there remain people ill and dying from the effects of what happened in Kurdistan. It also affects subsequent generations. The founder of SURF, the Rwandan charity, had, I believe, 80 members of her family killed, and carries to this day a tremendous guilt about her own survival. Primo Levi, Paul Celan, Jean Amery all committed suicide late in their lives, all Holocaust survivors, all having written in different ways that they had nothing left to say about what had happened to them. But what they wanted was control at that point over their own death, that they could cheat Auschwitz in the end by taking their own lives. Does it end when denial ends? And I won't say very much about denial. Gary talked about it. But in Stanton's model of genocide, the 8th stage is denial. And we will see more and more of it, I predict, as the movement for international recognition of Kurdish genocide builds, as the cases for compensation are won, so denial will increase over time. Historically, that seems to be always the model. Does it end when there is the admission of guilt? So what kind of guilt? The German philosopher Karl Jaspers emerged from his internal exile and wrote in 1948 a book I would recommend to everybody called The Question of German Guilt. In it, he identified the notion of criminal guilt. And a lot of what we've talked about today, and a lot of the lawyers who've been, various people have been very rude about today, are talking about forms of criminal guilt. But criminal guilt for Jaspers was only the beginning. He also talked about moral guilt, the moral guilt of us as individuals before our God, and political guilt, the responsibility of our states for their actions. And I think the tension running through debates on genocide, the tension that's been present today, is the tension between criminal guilt and political guilt. International recognition of genocide is actually not really set up for dealing with criminal guilt, but for political guilt. And I think the brilliant presentation of the Norwegian and Swedish compromises on that, parliamentary recognition, which, with all due respect, has no real political implications, is actually the route to get that kind of political recognition. Sorry, has no real legal implications, is the route to get that kind of political recognition. The metaphysical guilt that Jaspers talks about has also come through, and very movingly, in some of the things that have been talked about by non-Kurds today. It is the guilt that we were alive at the time at which these events took place. And we have heard of recurrence. Darfur, actually, in the end, was not recognized by the UN Commission. And in the conclusion, is one of the most extraordinary documents you'll ever read. There are several hundred pages of absolutely compelling evidence of genocide, and then a conclusion which says this is a series of events that fall short of the definition of genocide. It's a legal document with a political conclusion. And although the American government, as Dr. Kent said, were much better on Darfur than they had been on Rwanda, nevertheless, there was the same kind of complexity of political guilt and criminal guilt in those documents. And it takes a huge amount of time to get the recognition of guilt and the political recognition that we want. I had literally, I'm not making this up, had an email from my friend Arman this morning, who's director of the Genocide Museum in Yerevan. And it was an article that he's published, and he wanted some ideas as he gets ready to begin the campaign for the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide in 2015. He's still looking, and Armenians are still looking, for that political recognition that they want, and we all know the details of that case, still searching. But I return, and I'll conclude, Gary. If we achieve international recognition, we bring forms of justice through judgment. We see individuals punished in national courts. We see parliaments passing resolutions. At that point, does it end? I don't think it does. I think a phrase that I'll take away from today, the 100,000 untold stories. In many ways, we are watching and are part of a collective trauma that is playing itself out on political, legal, personal levels. And when we watch Gwyn's extraordinary film later on, we will see that the telling of stories will continue no matter what the structures of international recognition might deliver. And in that collective trauma, it is the telling of individual stories, telling of life stories, that can help deal with those traumas that continue to affect the nature of Kurdistan to this day, a traumatized population. So sitting there is always the possibility of recurrence. But also the silence inside Kurdistan needs to be addressed, and I think the work of the Kurdish Memory Project is a crucial dimension of dealing with this larger question of recognition, if recognition is to lead to closure, and if closure is to mean any kind of healing. Thank you.
Thank you very much.